Dean, and today's topic will be on financial lessons from the state of Illinois budget impasse. There's many lessons that can be learned from our history, and we have a great group of individuals to share with us their expertise and experience, as well as research of what they think might help us as we move forward together. Because the state of Illinois was one situation, but we have many other states experiencing that same challenge today. So the Higher Education Forum, otherwise found on Twitter at HiEd Forum, please feel free to follow us, chat, hashtag. It came out of a collaboration between Dr. Eric Felix at San Diego State University, he's an assistant professor, and myself through Twitter. I'm sure as many of us are connecting in social media in this current pandemic, this was how we connected. And we felt it would be helpful to bring together scholars, researchers, practitioners, policymakers to come together to share information and also provide it as a platform that could be utilized in the classroom setting as well for graduate programs or for future research. And so I'm excited to say that we've had this partnership. We've also had some past webinars as well, in addition to today's webinar. Our first one was on higher education affordability and the student impact. This is also viewable, same with the slides, at the Twitter location or at some of the links I'll reference here shortly. Had a session on internationalization in higher education, conducting critical policy analysis and advocacy, which was presented by Dr. Felix himself, as well as other collaborators. And our last session was supporting queer student success, which I thought was a really great session to highlight and discuss ways that you can engage with students when we're in this virtual environment, and engage when you cannot be with one another and see students like yourself in that campus environment. And they provided some really great insights for how to do that virtually. So we will take a moment here just so we can get an idea of who all is with us today. Please take a moment to complete the poll. We may have some students, we may have some instructors, researchers, some practitioners or administrators, perhaps community members, policymakers. As the poll results are coming in here, it looks like we have a mix of instructors, researchers, practitioners, administrators, policymakers, community members. Our students, I think, are done for the semester and they're taking a break. And that may be the case, but I also know that there may be potential for others to reference this in future summer course sessions, perhaps once they get kicked off. All right, thank you everyone for taking a moment to participate in the poll and for sharing where you're calling from or coming from. And please know that we have the chat enabled, and it would be great if you would like, feel free to chat in where you're zooming in from or calling in from, and let us know what area you represent, but also use that area to chat in questions. If we do not address that individual question while the panelist is speaking, we will certainly do so at the conclusion of the webinar as well. So feel free to be vocal in that sense as well. All right, so today's agenda, we will be highlighting each of our scholars and also our presidents, and they will speak on their areas of expertise and experience that they've lived, as well as each have their own individual remarks. We will have a panel discussion at the end, and then question and answer. And our panelists today, we have President Tom Ramage. He is the president at Parkland College. It's a community college located in central Illinois, located next to the Research One Land Grant Institution. And it comes with great opportunities and also great challenges that he will speak with us about. And I had the opportunity of serving as President Ramage's Dean of Enrollment Management at the time of the state of Illinois budget impasse. That was actually one of my first weeks, I think, as when he spoke on stage about the pending financial challenges we would be facing. Talk about an exciting time for an enrollment manager. I learned a lot from his leadership. And then we will lead into Dr. Christopher Mullen. He is the director at Education Commission of the States. And it was his book and research that I was relying on during my first course in finance at ODU that was helping me navigate these uncertain challenges. And then we'll turn it over to President Dietz. He's the president at Illinois State University, also in central Illinois, also happens to be my alma mater. and he will speak from the lens of how he navigated the fiscal challenges during the state of Illinois budget impasse as well. And then we'll close with Dr. Derek Houston, assistant professor at University of Oklahoma. He does have research expertise in athletics as well as finance, and we're looking forward to him adding to the comments from that university lens as well. And myself, Julie Marlatt, I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Old Dominion University for a Ph.D. in community college leadership, and I'm grateful for this group of panelists to come together to share their experiences. So without further ado, I will point out we have some readings available at the High Ed Budget Read, and you'll be able to reference several resources that you may find that would be of benefit for you as you are navigating these challenges. We'll mention these several other times throughout the session to make sure that you get access to those. You can also get them on Twitter as well. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to President Ramage, who I will refer to as Tom, otherwise he will be mad at me by the end of this presentation. Tom?
Julie, I'd never be mad at you, of course, ever. Just FYI, I think the polling results are still up on the screen, just FYI. So thanks. I'm happy to go first. I'm happy to talk a little bit about our situation and what we did to address the issue that you see on the screen, or the challenge you see on the screen. But every cautionary tale needs a little bit of history. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of history about how funding was supposed to work in Illinois, at least relative to community colleges. So that history is that when the system was developed, it was initially conceived in Illinois. The idea was that a third of the revenue for each community college would come from one of three different sources. The first source was a contribution from the state of Illinois itself directly to the institution. The second one was local property taxes. So community colleges in Illinois get a percentage or a portion of their funding from the local tax base. We're all divided up in districts. Every square inch of the state of Illinois is covered by one of 48 community colleges. Ours is about a 3,000 square mile district. So the tax base in that community pays a small amount. It's about 53 cents per $100 of equalized assessed valuation for you CFOs out there. And that comes to support the college. The last component of that funding stream is tuition and fees, of course, paid by the students. Now, this triumvirate of funding sources is somewhat of maybe a myth, because I don't know that it ever actually happened in Illinois. And it's certainly not true today, if it ever really was true. We were close. So back in 1997, about 25% of the funding that we received came from the state. So that's awful close to a third, but never quite there. And then as time went on, you probably know what the punchline is, that state funding declined, sometimes precipitously in terms of the budget impasse that we experienced, but nevertheless, it declined pretty regularly. We have put in a strategy in terms of tuition increases that's worked generally pretty well for the institution. We did small annual increases so that moms and dads could plan for what tuition would cost when their child came to Parkland College. They would be able to plan for that tuition dollar amount and know. So we tried to stay pretty much in that 5% or basically $5 per credit hour per year, sometimes as much as 7 or 8. And that worked pretty well for us for quite a number of years. That is until the state component of our funding declined a little bit more precipitously. And some other things happened. The cost of personnel, in particular benefits, continued to grow somewhat significantly. The other challenge we faced was a reduction in enrollment. And on the next slide, we can show you graphically what that looked like. So from a high in about 2010, we were recording about 207,000 credit hours per year. And as you can see, as you got out to 2018, that dropped to about 144,000 per year. Unfortunately, that trend continues, as it does at, I think, every single community college in Illinois, and probably a good number across the country. We're watching those enrollment declines. A lot of that has to do with our population, the fact that we're in the Midwest, a whole bunch of factors that probably we could do a whole nother webinar on. But that enrollment decline has been pretty significant over time, and something that we're working on remediating. And Julie helped us start that back when she was hired in those fun days to help get us our enrollment back on track. So essentially what happened here is our enrollment declines outpaced our increases in revenues. So even though we increased tuition and fees, the revenue that came in that way, the enrollment loss still made that a negative number every year, and that was obviously unfortunate. On the next slide, you'll be able to see what the state did for us. So again, back in 2007 there, you see not too bad of a contribution from the state of Illinois, but there's a steady decline that's very evident, and then something magical happened in 2015. That was a pretty bad year for higher education in Illinois. Basically, there was a little bit of a political conflict between the governor and the Speaker of the House that resulted in a budget impasse. Now, if you look at that slide, it looks like that impasse lasted just 1 year. That's not quite the case. It was a multi-year issue. What happened is after the impasse was resolved, about 2.5 years into it, we received some funding in arrears to make up for those days when we didn't get any money. But the important part is at the time that we were going through it, we didn't know how long this budget impasse would last. We didn't know if it would be a week. We didn't know if it would be 4 years until a governor was newly reelected from a different party and that impasse went away, or if the same governor would be reelected and that impasse would continue for presumably 8 years. So it was a bit of little bit of a concern for all of higher education in Illinois. This is compounded by the fact that in the reading materials, if you take a look at them, you'll know that there's a state pension debt or deficit in Illinois that is costing a large amount of money to be taken out of the state budget to service the debt and service the pension obligations every year. So that puts stress on other components of the state government, how much money they can spend on other components of K-12 higher education, all those services that come out of the state budget. In addition, there's a backlog of billions of dollars that are owed to every provider that does business with the state of Illinois. And unfortunately, education is at the back end of that list in terms of repayment by state statute, by court order, by a number of reasons. So our money that we did get from the state was often delayed, sometimes by months. So oftentimes we would get money in the next fiscal year that was to be supposed to have come in the previous fiscal year. So all bad situation. All these things are not going in a good direction. So on the next slide, you'll see the impact that budget impasse had on Parkland College in particular. So we have a performance indicator that's agreed upon with our board that we wanted to keep about 35% of a total year's funds in reserve or a fund balance. And we had that in 2012. It was at $19 million. When the budget impasse affected us, we spent out of that fund quite significantly. So at the end of fiscal year 2016, we had $9 million in reserves. Obviously, that sort of hit to the fund balance is not sustainable. One more year, presumably, if we didn't do anything, we would have been out of reserves, and that's an even worse situation. Student aid was reduced indefinitely. So the money that came to the colleges to pay student state grants was both delayed and frozen for a time. So we had to make some decisions about what we would do relative to our students in terms of whether they would be able to continue in school, relying on money that was promised to them but wasn't actually flowing. And another small component was the Veterans Grant. So when somebody signs up to be in the Illinois National Guard or the Army Reserves, they're guaranteed in-state tuition to be covered by the state. Well, the state passed that burden on to the community colleges and the universities, and our share of that money is about $600,000 a year. Again, a relatively small amount, but these small things tend to add up and make a more significant issue as they go. On the next slide, what we decided to do with all these bad things happening pretty much at one time was to take a slow and steady approach. We did not want to move fast. We didn't want to make any snap decisions. We didn't want to do anything that would be hard to undo if the situation changed quickly at the state level, at least. So we, in conjunction with that, we also wanted to do whatever we were going to do in a way that was sustainable going forward. In other words, we didn't want any temporary fixes that would put us right back in the same predicament if things changed again for the worse. We wanted to fix it as best we could locally going forward. And so what we did is some immediate expense reductions. These are fairly obvious. These are what you would think that a community college might do in the face of such large deficits. No travel. We spend generally between $1 million and $2 million on capital each year. That was all zeroed out. We didn't spend a dime on technology or infrastructure, beakers or books or anything like that. Each department was required to have a little skin in the game. We scaled back housekeeping and groundskeeping. We wrote more grants. We looked for rebates that would help us with our operating expenses in terms of green infrastructure. So we put LEDs on in every classroom or office that we could to help reduce our costs for energy on a given year. Small things, but they tended to add up. We put in a credit card processing fee. So every student that paid their tuition bill with a credit card, there was that surcharge that's pretty common today. We didn't have it for a well, forever until this budget impasse hit. And that's that's passing on another fee to our students. And additionally, we had some bonded debt that we restructured. It didn't do a darn thing for our bottom line in terms of adding money to the operating budget, but it reduced the taxpayers' burden. So by leveraging those favorable, better rates for bonds, we were able to reduce the tax rate, which certainly our citizens very much appreciated. On the next slide, you'll see our reaction to personnel. We stopped hiring, period. There was a freeze on all full-time permanent positions. Overtime went away as much as possible. We cut the budgets for our student and hourly workers. Essentially, we had no hourly workers left on campus. And we created what's called the Voluntary Separation Program. This is probably a common term that many of you heard before. Our Voluntary Separation Program was quite simple. Any employee who had been with us for at least 4 years and was not already in a declared retirement position was offered a $25,000 cash payout. If they left the institution, that cash payout came after they left, which was important because of a couple of idiosyncrasies to Illinois. And we had about 20 people who took advantage of that. More on the lower end of the pay scale. Not too many faculty, if any. I think maybe a couple took advantage of that, but it was mostly on the staff side. But those positions, we had the opportunity to either reallocate people who were still at the institution into critical positions or just not fill them after that person left. We eliminated our whole third shift housekeeping folks. They all moved to first and second shift. We reduced a supervisor, some number of people there. We have a formula that we use to decide how many students are minimum in a given section. I'm sure you all have the same sort of thing, whatever your formula is, but we raised our number by a few students in order to make that class go in a little bit more economical position than perhaps before. All travel, all that stuff went away. We were fortunate that the year that the budget impasse occurred, we were negotiating new contracts with all 4 of our unions, all at the same time. So we had the opportunity to make some changes in our healthcare benefits. We're a self-funded institution, and every dollar we can save on healthcare is another dollar that can go someplace else. And we switched our TPA, our third-party administrator. Again, we're self-funded and we rely on another company to manage that plan. And by switching, we saved a couple $100,000 a year. I think it was $150,000 the first year. Again, small numbers, but they tend to add up. Next page, you can see some state program modifications. As I mentioned, those MAP grants were frozen. We did not pay those out until money came in the door. Some institutions decided to front that money. In our case, it was a little over $1 million that we decided not to push out without assurances that money was coming in the back end. Same with adult education, a smaller amount, about $500,000. But that program was basically suspended until the state paid for that program, and that's 100% state funded just about. The next page, we increased tuition and fees annually. We have traditionally been 6th or 7th highest in the state of Illinois out of 48. That was a fairly comfortable position, but we had to increase a little bit more dramatically. We went up to 3rd highest in the state, and I think we're still there today. We put in differential tuition for high-cost programs in both career and tech ed and primarily in health professions. I think nursing and dental hygiene and those sorts of things. That was fairly well received. We didn't have, I don't think, any complaints that at least I heard of from students in those programs because they understood that that low faculty to student ratio and the nature of the program made it more expensive, and that's the way that works. We managed our investments a little bit more proactively and certainly asked our foundation to jump in as much as they could as well. So on the next slide, our current environment, or at least right after the budget impasse actually ended, well, let me back up before that. Along the way, we decided institutionally that we would try and never have ourselves be put in the same position again, or at least to as much as the extent possible. So we tried to not fill full-time permanent positions with state funding. So we wanted to reduce our reliance on state funding as much as possible. As I mentioned, the state restored those funding levels after the budget impasse ended at 85 to 90%. That was great to have it end, but it was still a reduction again in state funding going forward. Fiscal years 19-20 both remained just about flat in terms of state funding. We're at about 9% total state funding at the moment. And remember, that number used to be about 27%. We're at 9% and declining. Fiscal year 21 looks okay at the moment. That budget passed, I think it was yesterday or maybe today. It's flat funding, but it relies on $5 billion of borrowing from the federal government. It relies on a graduated income tax to be passed in November. If either or both of those things don't happen, all bets are off. We don't know what we'll see. I won't be positive. I can pretty much guarantee that. Our tax base has been basically stagnant, or was stagnant. It has increased again in the last 3 years. We're at about 4.5% growth, which is great, but we rely on that growth, that extra income to manage expenses that continue going up regardless of what the tax base does. Our enrollment continues to decline, arguably at a slower pace than it used to, but I think fiscal year 21 is going to be a very bad year in terms of enrollment. We're at, I think, down about 36% for this coming fall semester as compared with the prior fall, at least at the moment. Hopefully we'll make up some ground, but that's a lot of tuition dollars that are not going to be realized in fall if that continues. And of course, we continue this judicious hiring practice across all of our employee groups. On the next slide, you can see what happened to our fund balances. I know that's pretty small to read, but you can see that the top of the line for 2018 is back up to that almost $35 million. You can see 2016 where it dipped down. We've steadily increased our fund balance since the budget impasse by all these measures that have basically stayed in place. Some of them have stayed in place during that budget impasse all the way through today. This year that we're currently in, we're anticipating putting another $2 million or so into fund balance, which again is fabulous, because as the next slide tells you, history is going to repeat itself. And for us, it will repeat very, very soon. So all the things we did in 2016 to mitigate a state budget impasse and on our small declines in enrollment will be kicked in again to deal with what we're facing in the fall, mostly due to COVID-19, we assume. But we've done a very good job, I think, in 2016 with that slow, steady approach and making sure we didn't do anything fast or crazy. We're going to do the same thing again. Our board appreciates that. The community appreciates it. The students appreciate it. And most importantly, the employees. They know what's coming. They know how we're going to react. And I think there's a little bit of appreciation for that. So I hope I didn't go too far over well, I went way over, but I'll stop there.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. And I can attest to having an appreciation for the transparency that you provided as we were navigating the budget challenges. And I think that was very helpful as we were to better understand the decisions that were being made. We do have one question from Dr. Deb Bragg that I'd like to make sure we address before we transition to Dr. Christopher Mullen. And Tom, if you could go back to the budget impasse days. The question is, did the budget impasse have a disproportionate impact on enrollment, retention, and completion on students of color and low income? especially with the reduction of funds for student aid.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Bragg, for that question. Good to hear from you. I don't think so. We tried to prioritize ourselves in a way that minimized the impact on students. We did have to reduce the number of full-time faculty. We did that through folks who were not yet tenured. We just basically didn't renew their contracts. That was controversial. It was painful. It's something I don't ever want to repeat, but I think we might have to. But we kept all the programs that we had, and we didn't do anything differently, basically that faced the students. Our faculty to student, full-time to part-time ratio is very good. It's 70% of our sections taught by full-time faculty. I think that's helpful for our students. We maintain that ratio. Actually, it's gone up. But we did everything that we could to make sure that the impact on students from that budget impasse was as close to zero as possible, with the exception of MAP grants and those sorts of things, which was, we just couldn't front that money in a risky sort of way.
And the MAP grant that Tom is speaking of is a state of Illinois based grant that is specifically for students that are coming from a low income background. And there were implications for those students having access to funds during the state budget impasse. But thankfully, on the flip side, that was also when year-round Pell started kicking up. And so while we did have less students having access early on, then there was the benefit of the year-round Pell that kicked around later. But I think definitely some impacts there. Thank you for commenting on that. And so as history repeats, and I appreciate those lessons, and as I mentioned in the opening, I found comfort in reading research and literature on understanding higher education finance, which Dr. Mullen's book, it was one of the references that I read often to try to think through how to best help support Tom as he was leading the college and as I tried to drive enrollment. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Dr. Christopher Mullen.
Right. Thank you, Julie, for being here. Thank you, President Ramage, for sharing your thoughts and history on Illinois, and President Dietz, I look forward to hearing from you as well. I'll just give a brief overview. I worked in Illinois in 2008, and then when Barack Obama gave his speech at Macomb Community College in 2009, the day after I was hired to go to Washington, D.C. and become the Director of Policy Analysis for the American Association of Community Colleges as we entered the Great Recession. And I sat in meetings in the One DuPont Circle with Terry Hartle and David Boehm and the people that you read about in Inside Higher Ed. And we were charged with how do we bend the curve, because the Pell Grant program at that point jumped dramatically to about $32 billion. And what I wished I had was a menu of opportunities, or things at least to model and think about. So what we had to do is think from the ground up about what they were, especially coming from the college side. There were some more individuals from the university side who already had ideas about how to approach this work. And so that really, for me, sat as a professional opportunity of growth. Fortunately, about 2011 or 12, I was giving a talk and I was approached by Josie Bass to write a book on community college finance. One hadn't been written since 1983, I believe. It was been by two economists at the University of Virginia. And so we undertook the work with the focus of really how do we create a resource that's helpful to individuals who are practitioners on the ground. And so it's not theory, it's not, there's theories in there, but it's how do we empower you as a practitioner and leader to make decisions. And the best way we can do that is give you options of what other people have done. And so for this, the chapter in there in particular called Managing Fiscal Resources, I summarized it on LinkedIn so it's up and everybody can kind of get the meat of it, about how institutions responded. We read policy briefs, talked to presidents, did a large number of outreach, look anywhere we can from colleges and universities, and looked at the practices that we understood leaders made to try and help bend the cost curve within their own institution. I got some notes today from your personal cost reduction slide, President Ramage. I'll take. We're seeing things too, like in Georgia, where they're reducing salaries and or providing furloughs for different numbers of days, depending on where you are in terms of your hierarchy within the institution or system office, from 28 days down to 4. And so more models are always building, and the list isn't exhaustive. But we really looked to build a suite of resources where somebody can look at the book and say, here's a starting point of things we can do. And they got grouped into 5 basic categories. One is your administrative control and management is what we called, and you saw some of these in the slides, which include deferred maintenance, deferred library and equipment purchases, just delaying some of the things that you do, instituting a 4-day work week so your power bill goes down, and some other actions that you might consider taking. Institutional staffing, which is reduce the number of faculty and staff. We've heard about these. institute furloughs, freeze hiring, freeze travel, alter benefits, freeze professional development. Again, things that you've heard from earlier today, and there's a list of others. Look at your academic offerings. In some cases, there might be programs that, and this gets almost to the size that you need for a class to make, but how many people do we need enrolled in a program to maintain that program? There's also ways to do this with pruning and grafting, where you can merge programs together and do some cost savings there. There's a great book on that by Josie Bass as well. Enhance your revenues by raising tuition, issuing bonds, increasing your local funds, as we heard. And then institutional advancement from engaging alumni and lobbying efforts. Maybe what we did see some cases in a downturn was institutions who had larger resources investing in buying up property around their campus. And so what I should say is every state is unique, and great work done at the College of Education at Illinois State University by my old friend Jim Palmer, and before that, a list of other people from 1966 when M.M. Chambers started it. This is the academic in me. You have the Grapevine database that's really tracked over time the percentage of revenues coming from different revenue sources. That's been a staple. It actually informs and feeds the SHIO report every year. It's a partnership between those two institutions, or organizations, I should say. And Jim Palmer once looked and found about only 25 community colleges receive local property tax revenue. And so so we have half the states that don't have any local property tax revenue at all. There's reasons for that. If we look at the history, and it's all in the book, the Community College Finance book, but it's about who gets to maintain control over the institutions. If there's no local contribution, then the state has more control, even though they might be funding less. So Illinois is somewhat fortunate in the fact that they have this local property tax as an additional revenue source to diversify their revenue. And so we see a number of different changes, happening. One thing that's also occurring right now, and it was actually part of the CARES Act funding, and Ben Miller and others who are really writing on this issue and topic, and us corresponding with Sarah Gildrick-Grab just last week, is about how do we talk about funding? Is it per credit hour or per student? So per credit hour works a lot of times in our instructional cost models, but our student services and all those other supports are really headcount or person driven. And so I think there's an emerging conversation too about how we talk about what funding is, how we quantify it, and how we capture the amount of resources needed. And so I'll stop there, happy to answer any other questions, but that's an overview of how this book came to be, kind of what the chapter entails, and then a little bit more about some current thinking. Happy to answer questions as well as they arise.
And Dr. Mullen quickly shared some of those buckets, if you will, and you saw President Ramage outline some of those based on his experiences. And so if you do reference Dr. Mullen's LinkedIn site, and it's also cited in the additional readings, you could see literally 43 practices in each of those buckets, line by line, additional ideas, suggestions, or considerations. And I think really the important point is to note each state is different. Each state determines funding allocations differently, and each state will make decisions differently depending on their current climate as a result of COVID. And so it's very important to understand your current state climate, and because your friend on the East Coast may be doing X, it doesn't mean it would be applicable to Y where you're currently located. So thank you for sharing those comments and your insights. I appreciate that. We will turn it over to President Dietz. Lots of shout outs to the ISU. That was so great to hear the Grapevine reference, and Dr. James Palmer, he actually taught my community college class at my master's program at ISU. And so President Dietz, please share your perspective on an experience from the State of Illinois budget impasse, and then also lessons for today.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, for including me in the panel. Tom, good to see you again, and always good to be on with new colleagues. And I will preface this by saying that if, for the audience, if there are questions that you want me to answer offline, or you think of them after this is over, I'd be happy to try to do that offline. So I don't go over the the kind of detail that Tom provided, because a lot of that happened at the community college level also happened at the four-year public university level. Many of the same kind of strategies that were in place. But Illinois is a bit of an outlier in terms of, I think, the only state in the country that had 2 years of no budget. And so when the state has no budget, public universities and community colleges, et cetera, really have a budget. It's not that there's an absence of one, but it's just much reduced, and the uncertainty that all that presents to us is really a challenge. And so a lot of people said, well, how do you deal with no budget? Well, there was a budget, there just was no state funding in that for a very long period of time, and certainly no reliable state funding on that. I was talking to an alum, and I appreciate the alums that are both on the panel and on the line today. But I was talking with an alum recently who was talking about COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and said, well, golly, says, you know, in your first few years as president of Illinois State, your first year you kind of got through without a disaster. Then you had 2 years of no budget and a budget impasse, and then your reward for helping get the institution through that was a pandemic. But I do think that some of the challenges that we're all facing with this pandemic, even though that's not the topic for the day, harken me back to the days of the budget impasse that had its own challenges that fortunately were not part of the issue about health, but certainly created a lot of challenges for us. And I think we learned some things out of that I'll get into here shortly. But there are several lessons that, to me, that were kind of learned from all of this. The first lesson, or I would put under the general umbrella of political lessons. This is really a pitch to say voting is very, very important. And understanding who you're voting for and their stance on education, and helping students understand that as well, is very important. So as we went through that budget impasse, students played an important role in working with legislators and helping us tell the story. I learned a long time ago that when I put on a suit and tie and go into a certain meeting, that people are going to expect me as a president of a university to say certain things. It's always good if you can involve students in some of that process, because I really think they did a terrific job and continue to do a good job in Illinois for advocating for community colleges, four-year institutions, private institutions, the whole gamut. So I think we learned some things about that. I think we also learned a good deal about what a strong-willed governor of one party and a strong-willed Speaker of the House of another party and a strong-willed President of the Senate of the same party as the Speaker of the House, what can or what cannot happen. And unfortunately, during that really tumultuous years, there really was not a lot of communication that occurred between those specific individuals. Their staff conducted a lot of conversations, and a lot of individual conversations occurred with other folks. But in terms of working together to try to positively influence the future of the state of Illinois and higher education's role in that, the idea about leadership and the ability to influence and to move agendas forward without communicating is very, very difficult. And I think we found that out in many, many ways during that time frame. And all credit due to everybody. I think everybody entered the fray, the political fray, thinking they had the right idea or ideas. I don't think people go cavalierly into these kinds of issues, but the political lessons and the political environment is very, very important. And I think the students' role in this play an important role. And I think our legislative liaison staff play a very important role in all of that. Our alums can play a role in all of that. Business leaders can play a role. But to me, the most important piece out of that is that we need to help our leaders, our student leaders, continue to be good leaders and to try to work through issues of power struggles that really kind of brought the state of Illinois to its knees during those 2 years. During that time frame, as I mentioned, the state didn't have a budget, so therefore the public entities didn't have a budget. It was not only K-12 and higher education that was hurt in all this, but also not-for-profits that were involved in the service side of things, where many of them closed because they simply had no cash to continue. So the service sector was also hurt terribly in this whole process. There was no operational money. The 1 year, if you look at your current budgets and say, you know, you need to cut your budget by 70% in 1 year, and that's across all of your operations. I think most people would be aghast at that and say, you know, that can't be done. Well, that's what happened in FY15 that did spill over into FY16, as Tom mentioned on this. There was also no funding initially for the MAP grant program. Illinois State was one of the institutions that did front the money, hoping to gosh it would be paid at some point in time. And eventually we were, but a lot of institutions didn't have the cash to do that, and were very fearful if they never got the cash, what would happen. Reserves were eaten through during that time frame, and unfortunately at the public universities it was also a time frame where Illinois, that is one of the top 2 states in the country that has an outmigration of college-age students to other states. There was a time frame when the no investment in budget sent a clear message to a lot of those parents and prospective students that might have stayed in Illinois that we don't have a budget. We don't know if you're going to get any of the budget. And so therefore that outmigration that is already an issue in Illinois, with Chicago being the 3rd largest city in the nation, that outmigration was underscored during that time frame, which really didn't help any of the Illinois institutions. At the same during the same time frame, the birth rate 18 years before that had declined, and that continues to decline in Illinois. So the demography of students who are, quote, college age, if you will, is continuing to decline. So the market is shrinking, and the dollars are shrinking as well. There also was no money for any capital improvement. Matter of fact, there still hasn't been much money for capital improvement for over 10 years in the state of Illinois. So frankly, when our facilities were falling apart, what most of us did was to take money out of our operation budget and try to fix buildings and facilities that where the roof was leaking and health and safety issues were potentially compromised. So that added to the terrible issues that we all had to deal with at the time. I'm also serve as the convener of the public university presidents and chancellors across the state of Illinois, and Tom served in a similar role with community colleges. And one of the things that happened during that time frame is that as we came together to share our tales of woe, if you will, and also to strategize for the future, the community colleges and the 4-year institutions came closer together. And I would say that today that continues. The collegiality and collaboration, the positive collaboration really resulted from that, and we're continuing to work together as we did before. The crisis is really now around COVID and not so much around the budget, but we've continued to work together on budget and our legislative advocacy. So I think that was a positive thing that really happened there. But collectively for the 4-year publics during that time frame, enrollment was decreasing for most of those institutions, particularly for the directional public universities. University of Illinois and Illinois State were 2 of the outliers where we were either maintaining our enrollments or increasing the enrollments. And that frankly, for our institutions, didn't result in some of the dramatic impact that happened to a lot of the other institutions. As a matter of fact, at Illinois State, we didn't have any furloughs and we didn't have any layoffs. We didn't have any program closures or program reductions. Matter of fact, during that time frame, we also started a capital campaign. And during that time frame, I was told by a lot of folks, what are you crazy to start a campaign during this time frame? And it's actually, we will finish it this June, and it's been very, very successful. So despite the lack of investment in the state from the state at the time, our alums stepped up and helped us out. But so that was very helpful. I think some of the other financial lessons that were learned out of this is that enrollment is king. Enrollment drives the entire enterprise. And if you can help bolster that, it's really terrific. You've got to do that though while staying affordable and continuing to attract a diverse student population. And all those are terrific challenges today. And so we continue to work with that. But I think we did learn some positive things out of that. And the positive things are, in my estimation, this whole part about collaboration, about working together as we're stronger in working together than we are as separate institutions and separate sectors of institutions. So I think that was really important. Also locally out of that, I think a lot of us formed alliances and allegiances with our K-12 superintendents. And also some of our communities have private institutions that are located down the street or around the corner. And there's a community college just a couple of actually about a mile from where I'm sitting right now. And so I think those collaborations really are, continue to help us out. I'm also very appreciative that the leadership piece matters. I'll end where I started, and having a governor who is willing to work with the elected officials in Springfield has helped a great deal. I think that our times once we get beyond the COVID-19 thing are not without challenge, but I think we're going to continue to persevere. And I think one of the things that this budget impasse taught that I think is true today in today's environment is resiliency, perseverance, the importance of community, and the importance of collaboration. So I think good always comes out of bad. Sometimes when you're in the midst of the bad, it's hard to know what that's going to be, when it's going to occur, and what direction you're going to go. But I think out of that 15 and 16, we still have a lot of institutions that have not gotten anywhere near where they were with their reserves. The deferred maintenance is still a major problem. We do have some leadership in the Illinois Board of Higher Education right now who is wanting to help us market higher education generally for the state of Illinois. And I think that's really important. And I appreciate the shout out to Dr. Palmer. I would also mention that he's joined over there by another fellow who's a former chair of the Illinois Board of Higher Education, Jim Applegate, is a visiting professor here now as well. So let me end with that, but to say what a stimulating conversation I think that has started. I appreciate everybody's involvement with that. And Julie, thanks again for allowing me to be a part of this today.
President Dietz, thank you so much for sharing your experiences at Illinois State University during the budget impasse. I think you said a lot of really great things that resonate as far as community and collaboration, communication, and working with one another that I think does paint the picture. And you also mentioned that some institutions have not rebounded from the Great Recession, and there's some additional resources in the reading materials that would provide institutions some tools if they need some additional graphics and data sets to be able to articulate that story to either legislators, other policymakers, influencers, as you're trying to help people understand the current situation. You mentioned that you spent reserves to keep the campus moving and keeping the library dry, I'm sure, among other things. Is there a perception that there's still reserves to dip into at this time and we could just go directly there, or are institutions, specifically ISU, finding that a little bit more difficult to dip into due to depleting some of those reserves during the budget impasse?
Well, we were fortunate in that our enrollment was strong, so we didn't have that challenge, and that was a really big thing for us. But we haven't recuperated from taking money completely out of general operating at the time. Now the challenge is that we're taking money out of reserves for the COVID-19 situation for refunds of room and board, and those are bigger ticket items, and some fee refunds and those kinds of things. So it's a different pot of money in terms of being from the bonded areas, but we're also continuing to dip into some operational reserves for buying masks and looking at the potential testing of students and hiring additional staff. It's ironic now we're wanting to hire additional staff for to help us clean buildings. And in our case, while we didn't lay off anybody or furlough anybody, we also didn't replace the positions of a lot of people who retired during that time frame. And we had 100 and I think over 102 sticks in my head from F-15 and 16 who retired that we didn't replace. And the irony is that the bulk of that population came from our building service workers. And now we're in a different kind of crisis, and we're trying to add to that population, and we will. But the budget is a moving target, and it's a planning document. And I think as we go through tough times like we did then, you realize that you've got to be a lot more nimble than you'd probably planned on being, and you put things on the table that you thought at one time were sacred.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, we will turn the floor over to Dr. Derek Houston. He is Assistant Professor of Adult and Higher Education in the emphasis area of Intercollegiate Athletics Administration at the University of Oklahoma. He did earn his doctorate from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So again, we have some more Central Illinois folks that are connected and tied here. And his area of specialization and interest include quantitative methods, equity in intercollegiate athletics, equity and access relative to the P20 educational pipeline, education finance policy, and sociology of education. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to you, Dr. Houston. I believe you're still on mute, sir.
Perfect. I didn't know who had control. My apologies. Before we get started, and I want to thank you all for the invitation. Happy to be in conversation with you all. Just as a note, I speak to you from the land placed by its creator in the care and protection of the Caddo Nation and the Wichita affiliated tribes, the Waco, Kichi, and Tawakoni peoples, and originally shared by many indigenous nations, including the Kiowa, the Comanche, and Apache tribes, as a place of gathering and exchange. In the context of Illinois, we speak about the land placed by its creator in the care and protection of the Kickapoo, Miami, Peoria, and Sioux nations. So I'm a little different. I'm in Oklahoma, and I'm looking at this from a broad conversation around what's going on in the state, and what I've seen over the past 3 or 4 years, and then what I experienced from 2009 till about 2016. And so these slides are some things that I've put together relatively quickly to just look at who was being impacted and who will likely be impacted moving forward between now and according to the IGPA, the Illinois Governance and Policy Association out of University of Illinois, or whatever the name is, and talked about the financial impact to the state, somewhere between 12 and $28 billion over the next 3 years. So in doing that, I think about who has access and who doesn't. So again, this is a focus on higher ed students, but know that employees at these institutions will also be impacted, particularly part-time employees, adjuncts, and the like. It's also again on higher ed, but K-12 will also be impacted, given that in Illinois, K-12 funding is about 60% from local funds, so we don't know what the property tax will look like, who's actually going to be able to pay those taxes. 30% from the state, we know that's going to take a hit, and then 10% from the feds. In 2009-10, the state formula was prorated, so schools that K-12 institutions that didn't receive or that needed the money didn't receive their full per student award from the state. And then, so in thinking about this, I argue that, this is a decade-long issue. So starting at the recession and what we've seen over the past 10 years and what happened at the budget impasse from 2015, 16, 17. So just for context, just want to put this out there. The MAP grant, the Monetary Assistance Program, supports low-income and poor students in the state, similar to a Pell Grant. Pell eligibility is a great predictor of this. And this is looking at the state, not necessarily what institutions are doing, but the state has underfunded the MAP program since I can't say since its inception, but you can see that the number of students who have not received that money starting in fiscal year 04 and you saw a huge jump starting in FY10. So can you move forward? As of as of FY11, you saw 151,000 or so students not being able to receive the money. Huge jump until fiscal year 13. That plateaued in 16, and it's starting to get better. But I have a concern that given what the state is not going to recover, that there's a good chance you'll see these numbers go up over the next 3 to 4 years. And those impact are those that are most impact are those likely least able to afford to be impacted in thinking about this. Next slide, please. So again, more for context, the MAP grant, we saw that there's nearly 85,000 as of this year, at a peak of 160 some odd thousand in 2015, 2014. That number is based on a flat MAP allowance. So the MAP grant is not increasing at the rate of inflation, nor at the rate of higher education increases in the state of Illinois. So you're seeing almost a flat valuation. In essence, it's regressed given the cost of goods and services at each institution over the past 10 years. And it is likely to stay the same. As you see that the percent of that it will cover in 2020 is at 36% for community colleges and 34% public universities. Both are down nearly 20% for community colleges and 15%, almost 14% for public universities. So as costs increase and support, the value of support decreases, we have to think about who's most impacted and who is likely to be most impacted moving forward. Next slide, please. This is a slide similar to what it was last, but just as a bar graph of what's the percent of tuition and fees covered. This information, I believe, came from Illinois Student Assistance Commission. These are the folks that help cover the MAP grant. These two slides, and then so there's nothing new that I just talked about it, but you can see that in 2002, it was doing really well at public institutions, and now you're under 40% for 2020 at public universities. And I'm not speaking on private institutions, that's a different conversation. I believe that the majority of students in the state of Illinois go to attend public institutions. Next slide, please. So taking IPED's information and looking at who's likely impacted, I wanted to look at enrollment. So these are enrollment numbers, and I divvied these up by the demographic distributions for public institutions in the state. There are, shall we say, segregated spaces in the state. There are institutions where there are majority, the terminology majority, minority, I don't like using that, but a majority of students of color. These are Black, African American, Hispanic, American Indian, Alaskan Native students. And so over time, since 2010 as the benchmark, in general, the enrollment has gone down. And that's the same across the board for all the other institutions, between 25 and 49%, less than that, and then less than 15%. We do see increases in the Hispanic enrollment, but that's likely due to just the increase in population. But in general, you saw a dip in 2015, then to 16, and almost a flattening out from there. What you're starting in 12, there was a decline, and the question is why? Is it, is it because of money? Is it because of access? Because of, as what Dr. Dietz was saying, in terms of just the demographics, the outmigration, institutions in the Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Indiana spaces, Missouri spaces are actively recruiting folks from the state of Illinois and providing them lower cost options for out-of-state students, which for those on this call is maybe unsurprising. But for those outside of the context of Illinois, it's silly for what's going on. Next slide, please. Again, as I said, that you're seeing in general a downward decline in total enrollments. I don't see that changing. Again, with Hispanic enrollment likely due to increases in population as well. Not only, but as one case. So there's 2 more slides similar to this. Next 2. Again, same thing, and then the next one. And then this slide includes places like the University of Illinois. But again, in general, there's a total decrease. And I think President Ramage and President Dietz and Chris would all conclude that enrollment's down in general across the state. And this is just additional evidence. But there are some peaks and some troughs where there's likely concern about affordability, what's going to happen, how am I going to afford it, how am I going to pay for it. And so in thinking about money, we think about average net price, and according to colleague Sarah Goja-Grab, the net price that iPads uses is not accurate. It's decent, but it's a conservative underestimate of the impact of net price. So moving forward to the next one. But this is the data that's available through iPads. And again, we're looking, first, these are separated by community colleges based on demographics, and the last 3 slides are based on 4-year institutions. I had about 24 hours to figure out how to put this stuff together, and so I wanted, this was the best I could do, and the best way I could think about delineating or separating or disaggregating the information. But if we think about the populations that are most likely affected by finances, those are populations with incomes less than 75 grand. And I'm not saying that individuals making more than $75,000 are also not impacted, but there are some that there's a relative impact. And so for individuals, so at the nexus of money and race, so the intersection of money and race, you see that over time that the average net price from 2010 to 2015 increased. You had a little bit of a spike in 12 and a huge spike in 15. And I think Dr. Ramage noted that with the budget decreases from the state. So the state literally cut money away. And so the individuals who are most impacted are those that it was over 50% more expensive 5 years later to attend that institution. And these are first-time, full-time, so this does not include part-time individuals. And you can see that as of 2016, 2017, it flattened out to what it was in 2010. So we've kind of caught up. But in thinking about moving forward, there's a good chance that that number goes up. So is the state going to be able to fund MAP grants at the same level, even at a flat level? Given the community colleges, 1/3 of the money comes from local property bases. Will those property taxes, what are the property tax dollars going to look like? And the same thing with tuition. So, institutions are going to be constrained in how much they can actually raise tuition if they're not going to offer on-campus instruction. And so, thinking about who's most impacted, they're likely individuals who are students of color and poor individuals, and many times at the intersection of those two. Did we go back to, there we go. Oh no, go forward. Go forward. I'm looking at 2 presentations, one on my screen, one on your. Go forward. Here we go. Have I been talking about this slide and not being seen? Okay, this is what I'm seeing. Let's go to the next one. We can see it at institutions that are not as demographically diverse. There's 25 to 49% students of color. You saw a little bit of a spike in 12, not much in 15. There's more things to look at there, but in general, you do see an average net price that has increased over the past 8 or 9 years. And that's likely to go up for reasons I explained a minute ago. Next slide, please. This I'm still trying to figure out myself in the quick thing, but this is likely those spaces that are majority rural spaces that you're seeing that these spikes and then this continued flattening of the net price since 2010. Again, these numbers will go up. And as you can tell, the individuals that make the least are going to be impacted the most. And if we're thinking about who's been working, who hasn't been working, who has savings, who doesn't, these are likely populations that are impacted again the most. Next slide, please. And then finally, I'm still trying to figure this one out. I haven't had a lot of time to analyze this, but it's been flat. These institutions, who does that include? These are places like Carl Sandburg, Highland Community, Olney, Illinois Valley, Johnny Logan, John Wood. So a mix of places that are likely more wealthier compared to others. So again, individuals, it's flat, which is really intriguing. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last 3 slides, we look at 4-year institutions over the same time period and what it's like in certain places. So places that I know were hit hard were places like UIC, Chicago State, if I'm not mistaken, was hit extremely hard. They had huge layoffs, threats of closure. Eastern Illinois University, this was in 15. You saw a huge spike at UIS. For individuals that are making less than $30,000. Again, a huge spike in 2012, somewhat of a flattening until you hit 2016, and it's gone down a little bit. But at places like University of Illinois Chicago, it's still high. Places like Illinois State, it's still high. SIU Edwardsville, maybe because of the benefit of being near St. Louis and having tuition agreements in the Metro East area. Maybe that's the reason that they were lower than they were in 2010 compared to 2018. But these numbers should go up, unfortunately. And again, thinking about who's impacted and what can be done with it. Next slide, please. Similar patterns for rural populations that may or may not qualify for the MAP grant, may or may not qualify for Pell. Again, University of Illinois Chicago, Illinois State. Now this is relative to what it was in 2010. So, it's not saying what the tuition is or isn't. That's a different analysis. And then finally, next slide. And these are, it's flatter, but this number should go up too. It's going to be more expensive to attend school for multiple reasons. Now, I'm trying to think. There are some other notes. It's going to be interesting. Again, MAP grant funding is going to be likely impacted by what the state can or cannot do. I think President Dietz or Ramage, one of the two, mentioned the upcoming vote for progressive income tax. It's intriguing that it's one of the state of Illinois has one of the lowest personal income taxes. I mean, overall the taxes are high, but part of that is a function of lower personal income taxes. It's a flat tax, high, so it is regressive. So if something happens in 2020 to hit the 22 increase, to make the progressive tax rate go up, then things could be softened a little bit. But in general, I didn't have a chance to talk about employees. What's going to happen at places like Illinois in terms of the teaching staff for adjuncts. What's going to happen at places like Chicago State or Eastern, places that were impacted hard in 2012, that may not have recovered for 2015, 2016, and are still trying to recover. So we will see. With that being said, I'm open for questions.
Dr. Houston, thank you so much for providing the additional insights and knowledge, doing a deep dive really on Illinois. And you've even been away for a little while, and it's still, just like yesterday, you bringing up some of those other community colleges, I think from probably some of your surrounding hometown areas. I also like how you are referencing those that will be impacted the most. And as we are forward thinking, and I believe as President Dietz mentioned, doing some brainstorming of how can we best mitigate the challenges ahead, but also make sure we serve our students. I'm seeing the opportunity for economic and social mobility when you're putting out parental income ranges. And I like to use a tool, it's called the Opportunity Atlas, and this originates from the Chetty data.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see where the students or children are impacted the most. And as a former enrollment manager, and I love those data stories, I would overlay the financial information that we're getting from resources such as Chev or Witchy or from Shiowa, and then also looking at our state, but then looking at our student regions that are least likely to move their way up out of the poverty ladder. And so I really appreciate you calling attention to where we need to be thoughtful, and we'll have to work a little bit harder to make sure we achieve that.
Just as a point of clarification, not clarification, but critique of the Chetty piece, I'm a fan of it. It's limited by, it doesn't segregate in terms of racial and ethnic outcomes outside of opportunities for mobility. But for those not in the state, Southern Illinois, I'm originally from a small town of 750 people, but 20 minutes north of Cairo, down by Shawnee Community College. The Southern Five or the Little Egypt area, that's going to be impacted hard. Places in rural populations are going to be severely impacted. I think we saw in 2015, 2016, what could happen over the next 4 years by the institutions. Illinois State is positioned well. The University of Illinois system is positioned well. The state schools are not. Chicago State, Northeastern, Northern Illinois, Eastern, Western, SIU Carbondale, maybe, but SIU Edwardsville is a little bit of a outlier with those institutions. But Western Illinois has seen a huge drop in enrollment. And so what's the other thing to consider is not only the students, but also the personnel. What happens when institutions lay off a number of employees? What happens in Ullin, Illinois, when Shawnee Community College has to lay off 40% of its instructional staff or even other staff? What happens to the economies around us? So there's this wave, this ripple effect that is likely to happen in those areas that like a DeKalb. What industries in DeKalb, Illinois? What industries in Western Illinois? In Macomb? What industries in Charleston? Outside, I mean, these institutions of higher education are large employers in those areas. And so what happens long term? And as President Dietz mentioned, Illinois State didn't have to have any layoffs, but they also haven't rehired. They also haven't filled those positions. And so you put straight, there's the conversation can divulge in multiple places, and I'll leave time for questions. So I'll be quiet now.
Thank you for adding the additional insights. And I will open it up. President Dietz, if you'd like to share, and for any of the panelists to share some of the proactive measures that you're thinking about putting in place or already in motion for the upcoming semester or year.
Well, we had a lot of really great plans up until March, and some of those have gone by the wayside given the other challenges that are facing us right now. But I think the critical role that the MAP program plays in the state of Illinois can't be shouted out enough. Bottom line is that about until this past year, we got some increased money in that, and we also have a new program, state program called the Aim High program, which takes the MAP and puts a merit piece onto that, and that has really been, in my estimation, a new program with dollars that address a different population. But whenever the one of your significant programs in the state, like the MAP program, the need-based part of that, when half of the people who apply for that program don't get it because there's no money, that is in my estimation, a terrifically wasted opportunity for the individuals who might have gotten some money that allowed them to go on to school, contribute to the tax base, be contributing members of society, who all of a sudden decide, if I don't get the MAP money, I just can't go. Well, if they don't get the MAP money and they don't go, they're not going to get the Pell money either. So the state of Illinois is leaving large amounts of federally funded Pell Grant dollars on the table. And we need to figure out a different way of broaching just that MAP program. We also need to look at the enrollment patterns around here. We talked a little bit about outmigration. And for students who are going outside of the state, oftentimes that first year from a net perspective may be less expensive out of state. But typically those states that have done that front load that first year, and they don't and then they don't load the other 3 years for that student. So ultimately, the Illinois Board of Higher Education has done some research on this and has shown that it's really not cheaper to go out of state than it is to stay in Illinois, particularly when you add in some of the subsidies. And that was only MAP funded at 50% of what the needs really are. So I think there's a lot of room for both politicians at the state level and the federal level to get their heads together and make sure that we're not giving Illinois Pell dollars to another state, because there's a lot of other states that have figured this out. And they're very eager to keep the Illinois money that might have been here had the student been eligible for the MAP and then would have stayed because they also have the Pell. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration on that. The other thing that's really not been discussed is that during these times of overall enrollment declines, there's really not been any adjustment in the relative state appropriation that all of the public universities in the states have received. So if you got X amount of dollars 10 years ago, and you've lost 50%, 20%, whatever the percentages of enrollment, you still are getting that same relative appropriation among all the public universities. So stated in another way, I think it's time that the state of Illinois take a look at a whole new strategic planning process, and I think that's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. That was on target to begin in January, and hasn't because of COVID and so forth. But for example, if you look at the lowest per student appropriation in the state of Illinois, Illinois State is the lowest by $2,000 above the next lowest. And the range goes from about $3,000 for us to over $14,000 in the state for other institutions. So I think it's time to take a look at all of that and you know, hopefully come to a conclusion about, you know, what's good for the students, what's good for the state, because we're a part of this whole process of educating our students. Companies want to hire our graduates, both at the community college and the four-year institutions. They want to hire educated folks to do the work that they're doing. We're just not producing enough folks for that. And so I think there's lots of ways to collaborate, cooperate, put our heads together to try to solve these issues. And I think most of us want that to happen. So I'm up for that. And we've been talking about that for some time. And, you know, this COVID issue will get its place in history at some point in time, as will the FY 15 and 16 budget impasse and the history of funding for the state of Illinois. But we've got to, in my estimation, have a better plan than what we've had versus just reacting to the crisis du jour, if you will.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, and picking up on Dr. Houston's analysis, is that one thing I learned real fast when I worked on federal student aid policy is there's two policy levers that a state or leaders who have control of the funds can do to bend the cost curve. One is you change the eligibility criteria so fewer students can get it. And the second is you decrease the amount of money that's available. And it looks like in the MAP program, from what was shared, it looks like they decided to do both. And those are the only two ways that you can really get that in a constrained resource environment. Those are two policy levers you pull. And from the conversations I've been involved with in my life, those are the two things that we wrestled with. Do we decrease the total cost of the Pell Grant program in 2009 so the same number of students can get it, but they get less, given that we only have X amount of dollars in the bucket? Or do you change who can get it and keep the Pell Grant maximum at the same number of times? So those, as insight, those are like the policy conversations that happen with system offices. I should share that I worked in a system office for the State University System of Florida for a number of years, and then at the Florida College System after that as the Executive Vice Chancellor, and we had to redo our funding model. And I pulled together the chief budget officers from all 28 community colleges, and we made 54 changes to that funding model to make it better and stronger. But those are hard, protracted conversations because every lever you pull and every calculation you change, the numbers shift and the numbers shift. So that's the hard part about addressing ingrained bias and funding structures, is if you only have $100 and you change the levers, somebody who used to get, to your point, like $12 is now might only get 8, or somebody might get 18. And so those are, to start at the beginning, the policy conversations where the politics and policy come into it. But there's work to be done in this space for sure. And I just applaud both presidents here in all sincerity, having worked for 12 years of my professional career with presidents in the tough positions that you're often put in to make the best possible decisions within confined constraints that you have to operate in. And that's what made today's webinar so exciting for me, is you have to live in an imperfect world, and how do you make the best possible decisions in an imperfect world? Wishing that the MAP was fully funded, wishing that the state actually met their things, wishing everything was true. How do you make these decisions? I think you had a nice job of sharing that today.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. That is a great segue. And with our time that we have left, I will open up if some of the panelists would like to share what are some key takeaways that you would like for folks that have joined us or that might watch this later to be able to take with them, potentially take back to the campuses and have discussions, or to their policymakers.
Maybe I can just add a couple of things. One, in response to Greg Schuckman's question about, what the future looks like in terms of higher education adjusting to what's coming. I spent some time with on a book by Nathan Groff from Carleton College. It's talking about the demographic shift that's coming. And I think he lays out the case, as others in this webinar have mentioned, that I think this is just the very beginning of a contraction. I see no evidence that contradicts his assumption that, or assertion that, in the Midwest in particular, and Illinois in particular, we're going to see about a 30% drop come 2026 in the number of college-going people in our state, for a number of reasons. Fewer people, as President Dietz mentioned, and also the flight to other states for a number of reasons. So I think it behooves us that those of us that will still be in education in 2026, higher education in particular, to factor that thinking into the decisions you make today, so that approach to making your institution as lean as possible for when those days come that you're forced to make decisions and hard decisions. The net impact of sort of forced change at Parkland in the budget impasse days was 6 employees, 6. And it was, the reverberations are still felt today. And the people who I know that are on and listening will very much agree with me. That will never be forgiven. To Mr. Mullen's point, it is impossible to make the right decision to please everybody at all levels. The best thing we have is what allows the institution to survive, number one, and well, not number one. Number one is to serve the students, and you serve the students by, 2, allowing the institution to survive. So that is our decision-making trajectory. It's how do we keep the programs, the faculty, and the students engaged in what we do on a daily basis. And I'll retire with that philosophy in 930 some odd days.
No one's counting. Would anyone else like to share any parting words before we wrap up today?
I would just like to echo what some of what Tom said there, but I'm a bit of an eternal optimist. I think that all the good scholarship that all the academicians are providing on call today, that's very important. We need to be guided by as much data and fact as we can. And then politics will always fit in some way, but we need to be informed by the good work of the scholars that will help us figure out solutions and give us good data on all this. But I'm a firm believer that we are up to the task, and the task is one that I think is complex, but but I really do believe in the newer generation of folks that are coming in at some point to replace Tom and me. So all of you younger professionals out there, you got your work cut out for you, but by the same token, it's terrific work to do. And I'll just speak for myself on this, though I think Tom would agree, that it's very important work and it's very fulfilling work. So I encourage folks to stay true to the task because our future generations need you.
Thank you for sharing those words. We do have some other comments. One was about the role of endowment and such distress. If anyone would like to add any parting thoughts as far as how endowment plays into this, and then we'll wrap it up.
We're going through a campaign process, as I mentioned, that started several years ago, and we had a goal of raising $150 million for the university. And I'm proud to say that even during tough times of the budget impasse, that our contributions continue to stay steady and all of that. And we raised that $150 million a year early. And so the current campaign will end June 30th of this year, and we're close to $178 million right now. So I think that there's no good time and no bad time to start campaigns. Our alums, I think, expect that. They want to give back. They want to help out. They want to give the place that they feel like that gave them a leg up. They want to provide that opportunity for other people. So I think that campaigns have been a part of our fabric for a long period of time, and they're going to continue to play an important role. But I think a lot of that, you heard the analogy of the icing on the cake. I think the icing is getting a little thicker, but in my estimation, we're never going to be at the point where we ought to be relying upon that to build the entire cake, because I don't think the resources are there, nor do I think that's the mission for a good advancement program. But it can certainly provide some terrific icing, and it can certainly be dollars that can help out in a tough situation, but also can help redefine the work of the university. And I'm very fortunate to work at an institution where the donors have been very generous and very supportive, and have shown that through the contributions that they've made.
Thank you, President Dietz. I do think it is important to echo the comments that the funding would not and should not come from one area, whether that's endowments, fundraising, or enrollment, or freshmen. It's really important to look at all aspects, whether it's transfer student pipeline, graduate student enrollment, continuing education. Every single component of your institution makes up your student population, your student body, and does contribute to that bottom line. So thank you for sharing that. So as we conclude, just a reminder, there are additional resources available through the readings. And then we also have another webinar coming up on supporting foster youth in post-secondary education. And this is also Foster Care Awareness Month. So we hope to continue the messages as far as tying scholars and practitioners together to hopefully make an impact for those that were able to join us today and will be able to join us later. So I'd like to thank our panelists, a recap of who joined us today and their current locations. If you are on Twitter, feel free to follow us on Twitter. We will post the recording and the slides. We'll link the resources so folks can get access to this great information and share it out in other networks.